Thank you so much, Gregory. It's always good to see you again. And I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the board of iHeart. Thank you so much for, again, a wonderful conference. And to Donna and the team, congratulations on such a stunning turnout in this wonderful event. To all of you, thank you so much for staying for this last conversation and also for doing what it is that you're doing with our communities. And I really hope that some of the interests that I've had over the last couple of years might become interests of all of ours, because there are some really important survival imperatives that underpin this part of the conversation. So, without any further ado, and hopefully I'm not going to sound too much like an auctioneer, what I'd like to do is acknowledge the lands of the traditional peoples on which we're standing today and pay our respects. I'd also like to acknowledge all of my heritages, and I'm now going to hashtag Celtic Islander, just so that I can really embrace all of these things. I've spent a great deal of my life trying to be separate, but now I understand with the imperatives that are changing with the Anthropocene that actually what we need to do is come together as a species. And so that for me is a member of a species rather than a member of a race. I also want to acknowledge the youth in the world and really pay incredible honour to their calling out for climate justice and climate change. We are living a life in a way which is robbing them of their future, and I'm so proud of them for standing up in some really terrible circumstances. And to young Greta, who said that her Asperger's is her superpower, all strength to her, she is quite remarkable. But what I also just wanted to put up there is a part of the Imagination Declaration, which for me was just an extraordinary calling out from Dharma, following on from the Uru statement from the heart, and the idea that we have 60,000 years of genius and imagination in our hearts and minds, and that we can be one of the groups of people that transform the whole world. What I love the most about this Imagination Declaration is that they did not put themselves in any boxes. There were no parts of that declaration that talked about race. They just talked about what it is that they're inheriting and the fact that we shouldn't bound them in any way, that they needed to be given any opportunity to do and be whatever a human mind can dream. And so in honour of all of them, I really want to talk to you about this incredible transition that we're going through as a planet and why this is incredibly important. From about 1940s, and there has been some discussion about when the Holocene actually transitioned into the Anthropocene. What we're seeing now is a new geological era that's starting to emerge on the planet. It is started in the 1950s, so we've actually accelerated over this period of time since the 1950s, which means that in a single human lifetime, we have become the singular geological force that is shaping all of the planet and the planetary processes that give us life. In terms of that, we've got a whole range of 24 separate global indicators that have been tracked since the beginning of time, and what we're now finding is that planetary processes are driven mostly by human consumption and production patterns, and this is an enormous concern for about 20,000 scientists, but should be for all of us. In terms of how stable it's been in the last 11,500 years, we've been able to live within the confines of the environmental processes of which we're a part. We've been able to make the transitions as a species from hunter-gatherers through to agriculturalists, and now we're moving into urban areas. But what we've got alive at the moment on in the planet is unprecedented ever. We've never had this many of our adolescents alive at any other time in the history of the planet, really. And that is coming about at the time when we've also part of the 6th largest mass extinction. So what we've got is this population bubble of adolescents, unprecedented, at the same time as we're exploiting planetary processes to a point where we just can't sustain the way that we're going anymore. And we've got some civilizational challenges that I believe that First Peoples are very well equipped to respond to and take other people on a journey with us. So we believe that humanity can flourish really well within the 9 bounds that have been set up around the planet, and we've actually crossed 4 of those boundaries, and we've now got an increased risk paradigm of which allied health professionals will be front and centre of having to deal with in lots of different instances. We've got rising levels of greenhouse gas, And we've got a range of pollutants that are now occurring as part of the normalisation of how we're living. And even at the Paris Climate Agreement, there was some agreement sought where we wouldn't raise above 1%, 3% by the end of the century, but that's already going to put a number of people and places at incredible risk. What we really want to be able to get people to remember is that we're not actually born into societies, we're born into ecosystems, and that is absolutely consistent with a whole range of our cultural determinants, and particularly the one about care for country and living in the bounds of the country. We've got biodiversity being lost at a rate of 100 times greater than any background rates in pre-human times. We've got an over-reliance on fossil fuels. Even our work, as we do it at the moment, our academia, even conferences, heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So what we've learned to do incredibly well is work within the bounds of a fossil fuel and highly consumptive environment. Because of the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the planetary systems at the moment, our oceans are acidifying, and we've got the ecosystem collapse, which is also being driven by the use of plastic. And a lot of our medical and health service deliveries are highly reliant on plastics. What this means then is quite phenomenal. I'm doing a piece of work at the moment looking at health and housing, but we're now even having to consider what instability in terms of climate and weather patterning means for housing's infrastructure, what that means in terms of people building the houses and heat stress and a whole range of other things that will come about. We've got a drop in the equator, which is moving slowly south, which means that a whole lot of the diseases that are vector-borne, which haven't actually infected or had much to do with our populations at this point in time, are slowly moving south as well. And we've got a whole range of food security and foodborne diseases that will happen because a lot of the refrigeration in our communities is geared to operate really well at about 42 degrees. But in Alice Springs last year, we had 45 degrees days, 45 days in a row. That has profound impacts for food security and the like. And as much as we talk about getting out on country, soon it's going to be too bloody hot to get out there. And so in terms of some of these things, what we've got to do is mediate these circumstances. We'll see increases in poverty above what we're seeing and experiencing globally, but also what we want to be able to do is really think about those who are most vulnerable to climate impacts have had the least to do in contributing to the current state that we're now in. And in fact, the Anthropocene is often called the Anglo-ocene because there is a particular way of living that has facilitated some of these ideas. But what this means for health professionals and allied health professionals in particular, I really think is some pivotal questions for all of us to contemplate. How can we deliver health and wellbeing services that are not reliant on fossil fuels? How can we actually do that? How can we move from human-centric to ecosystem-centric approaches in the way that we do our lives? Absolutely putting our human existence in the context of the health and wellbeing of the ecosystems in which we live. How can we actually bring 21st century ideals which are specific to the Anthropocene, when most of us are heavily invested in Holocenic institutions, thinking, processes, disciplines, jobs, professions, and mindsets? There are new and emerging opportunities that are coming on board, and what is it that Indigenous peoples in particular can do to bring the rest of humanity back into an earth-bound sense of reality and value? And they are our questions to ask, but they're also ours to answer. So in terms of some of our elders from various institutions and who have been part of our families for years have told us how to do this. It was very clearly articulated here about what it means to be well and healthy, and talking about our identity as human beings, not as Indigenous peoples, as human beings, remains tied to our land, cultural practices and systems of authority and social control and intellectual traditions, concepts of spirituality, and to our resources of resource ownership and exchange. If we deny this relationship and only make it available to our populations and not to the 24 million people who are also living on the context of this planet, then shame on us. Shame on us. Cultural determinants actually gives us a lifelong map to connect to country. And this is important now for all of humanity, not just for us. And so in terms of what this looks like and how it's expressed, I think is really important, because what we need to do is try to explain these connections and relationships, and in terms of how we explain it, then get people to engage with the ideas about how to live in the context of country. These things are profoundly important, and they are really important for us to communicate and role model for other people. Some of the work that we're seeing some great promise in is the introduction of nunkaris into South Australia and Western Australian hospitals. That came about as a change of legislation through the Mental Health Act, and people are now actually able to facilitate the traditional healing, but they're also making themselves widely available for other peoples to also access. So they are making that knowledge and that context available for everyone. And in terms of what it is that we've got, I'm looking at Ray Lovett here, and the work that's underpinning a lot of his effort is really fundamental to the cultural determinants. And Donna gave me a wonderful task, but Sissy, it's doing my head in. She asked me, how do you implement cultural determinants of health? I said, right, I'm on it. And I went, oh my heck, this is actually really bloody hard. But I'm writing a report, it should be finished next week. You'll be very happy to see, and it's called Country Can't Hear English. And the reason why it's called Country Can't Hear English is because of the Lowick Institute. There was a woman from Pinterby Homelands who ended up crouched down on the stage with a little peephole in front of her face, and she was underneath a white blanket. And what she talked about with that white blanket was that was the ideas of white Australia just oppressing her, and we couldn't actually see each other except through this peephole. And in terms of the intimacy of the nature of her relationships to country, it could only be effectively communicated through language that was intimately connected to those places. And so in terms of that, anything that we can do to revitalise language is of critical importance for all of us now. Again, based on Ray's work, and then just mapping it across all the other social and emotional wellbeing models, particularly those that were developed up by Pat Dutchin, Graham G, Kerry Kelly and others. We've actually got 6 domains that we've built into this report because we can track them over time. We all understand intimately that care for country and that level of connection, and understanding that is both physical and spiritual relationships. Knowledge and beliefs, these are part of the relational identities that we have, and how they're enacted and enhanced is through art, songs, ceremonies, corroborees. It can also be done through healing, access to traditional medicine, understanding that there are gendered knowledge systems and public and private knowledge systems. We also just heard about the importance of Indigenous languages and how they transmit cultural knowledge to the next generation, and this is heavily coded information. It is computational, and really is built into algorithms that underpin our mathematics, which is profound. There's also this idea of self-determination, and whilst most of us think about it as organisational and political levels, it's actually about self-regulation. How do we regulate ourselves? How do we govern our families? What is it that we're teaching our children? How are we role modelling different kinds of behaviours and things? Kinship and relationships, we often struggle just within the health services that we're part of to communicate about the fact that we have got extended family relationships, and we all have particular roles and responsibilities to enact in those spaces. There are observances, there are avoidance relationships, but fundamentally they are elder wisdom-based societies. They are elder wisdom-based, and so that is why we refer to the elders in the way that we do. The other part is cultural aspirations, and for me this is a really fundamental one, because all of the ways in which we have been trained starts with a hypothesis that actually problematises something that we then need to solve. First 1,000 Days Australia has really been focusing on not caring about people's experiences of vulnerability. Don't care, really don't. What I'm interested in is people's aspirations. And then we create the opportunities for people to experience mastery by hooking them up with life coaches and mentors, and they get confidence, and then we bring them back. I've had peer researchers who are public housing tenants come and teach into master's degree courses, train them up to be peer researchers, and now they're still participating in the delivery of not only their experiences, but they're teaching people. It's extraordinary what happens when we actually think about how we can do this work well. Most of us talk about place-based work, but again, because of Donna's leadership in this space through IPAG, what I've been really thinking about is how do you actually let things emerge rather than try to control a policy or program production process from a central office in Canberra that gets filtered out through different tiers and layers through to people who don't actually understand what it is that they're meant to do or how it's meant to be achieved, and then impose those ideas and tell people through a contracting arrangement that you're meant to achieve these level of outcomes within this period of time. So what we're doing is working with ideas and theories of emergence, so things that emerge from within those places. And the reason why we like this is because it's as near a social construction of a natural living system, which is inherently in country. And this is what we do. So we work with emergence as a process. We introduce cultural domains and experiences that people can participate in. And then what we do is create change-capable networks. I won't work with a representative organisation anymore. I'm too old and a bit too crusty to have to sit in rooms with people that I don't appreciate, like, or even want to hear from anymore. It's not that I'm precious, I'm really not. But I can't have these head-to-head conversations anymore. That's why I left a university. If I can't hear your heart talking to me, and if I can't find a way to relate to you as a heart-to-heart context, then I can't work with you. And the impetus for this is just too powerful. When you've got people who are environmental champions who are saying we have got 12 years left to change our world, then the imperatives to find heart-to-heart connections rather than head-to-head ones are powerful. So what we do is we use ecosystems as a framework to bring about these kind of change-capable networks. We work with them as networks. We don't call them anything else, because as soon as you move them out of a living system network, then you're in a hierarchy. And what we try to do then is support the communities of practice developing. And so these emergence practitioners is what we're referring to them as. They help facilitate, they nurture, they create, they give birth and life to these different processes in place which actually tell us how to achieve things. It also helps us then embed things like ceremonial observances into the core features of our work, which help really build and respect the artisan qualities and skills. We facilitate engagement with language. We do intra-family and between-generational work. It's been really very exciting to see then how these emergent networks create influence, and they harness the capabilities of that influence by really becoming evident through local and regional programming, the creation of cultural programs, and also then when alternative systems of emergence start to appear, what we then find is that dominant systems start to preserve themselves as they begin to decline. So that's when, you know, the rubber needs to really hit the road. So emergence practitioners need to be at the forefront of this effort for at least 5 years. That's how long it takes. We all need to be concerned with our families' futures. And in this continent, because it is an island nation, every single Australian life, including those of the beings that we're sharing this particular time with, some of which are being extinct at a rate of knots. What we need to do is understand that we are in the context of an Indigenous presence. 65,000 years means that Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders less so because we've only been on the Torres Straits for about 18,000 years or so, but Aboriginal people have been on this continent for 65,000 years, and it is one of the most ecologically sensitive civilizations on the face of the planet. I think our ill health should be an indicator of how poorly we're managing our environment, because our health is so closely aligned to it. So a new world, and what as allied health professionals can do in this space. We have to understand and quantify the characteristics that lead to strong, thriving families, but also include environmental determinants in that space. We also need to think about ensuring alignment of those cultural determinants, the environmental determinants with families and communities in real time. In terms of emergence, it is a complex system construct. The pipeline is false. Dealing with us as a singular process in a planning regime is wrong. What we need to do is work with complexity, become friends with uncertainty, and understand specificity is gone. There's no such thing to it anymore. And in terms of where I think we need to go, it is around developing up an Australian Indigenous implementation science that's really founded on these 4 things. So there are social movements around cultural vitalisation. That can't be a policy process, it really can't. As soon as we make it a policy process, it lends itself to being exploited. We also need pathways for learning cultural practices. And if that means that when young people who've experienced long-term intergenerational trauma as a result of stolen generations need some support to actually get cultural parenting, then let's make a Cert 2 up, don't care. But in terms of that, the cultural-led workforce, really not thinking even in a professional context, but reactivating the roles and responsibilities that we have within extended kinship systems, and making not only families as first teachers, but first health workers, first counsellors, first everything else as well. They are skills that need to be embedded within our families, and also, again, culturally safe engagement with health services. The implementation architecture that this world and planet needs is absolutely fundamentally relying on Earth systems realities. And there is the theories of cultural continuity, which might need to be taught. Processes of implementing culturally determining is absolutely empowering, and then we need to be able to facilitate and discuss consensus where possible. The recovery from colonisation isn't ours alone. There are so many other peoples on this planet and our country that has actually been colonised too. The cultural authority and cultural leadership is critical in terms of cultivating the qualities which are informed, credible, strategic, connected and sustainable is really important, and also then the empowerment methodology. So a lot of you would have spoken over the last couple of days around co-design, being person-centred, but also then starting to change some of the boundaries. Why aren't we doing jurisdictional data collection in the context of First Nations? Why aren't we linking up through songlines as a way of being able to know that there was a connection between all of us? How come we're doing it in administrative data sets that is very difficult to get in touch with? In terms of data sovereignty, I just spoke about that, but also these, I don't really want to have our families mapped against non-Indigenous kids anymore. Non-Indigenous peoples belong to biocidal society. Why on earth would we want to measure our own human health and well-being against a group of people who have colonised our country in a way which means that the impacts are intergenerational? We don't need contract managers. If you work in the public service, what we need now are policy entrepreneurs, people who can actually innovate, who can take innovation to scale, who can actually be flexible enough to really build in a whole range of different and new look workforces, and that can take technological utilisation to scale. And we also need to know why we're doing this work, and we need to be able to create a consensus around that. This planet actually needs us to do this. It's not even about us anymore. If we are a geological force that is affecting planetary systems, that it is only us that can bring it back. And in terms of that, the two-way learning, healing flowing through generations and allowing for collective approaches is also really critical. It is really hard to keep hope in the Anthropocene, but what I'm hoping is that when the world quiets to the sound of our own breathing, we all want the same things, and that's love, comfort, and a peaceful heart, and a planet to live on. Thank you.